What you think you know about Alexander the Great may not yet be complete. For before he became the conqueror of the ancient world, before his name thundered across history alongside battles that shook civilizations, Alexander was merely a child born into a kingdom that was widely scorned. In 356 BCE, the Greek world was no longer at its peak. Athens and Sparta, names that had once commanded fear across the Mediterranean, were exhausted after decades of relentless warfare. They still regarded themselves as the center of civilization, and from that lofty position, they cast their gaze northward with a mixture of contempt and unease. There lay Macedonia, a rugged mountainous land, dismissed as crude and backward, skilled in war, perhaps, but lacking the refined spirit of authentic Hellenic culture. Yet history often chooses its beginnings in the most unexpected places. That same year, in the capital city of Pella, Queen Olympias gave birth to a boy. He was named Alexander. No one could have known that with this first cry of life, a chain of transformations destined to unfold over centuries had quietly begun. His father, King Philip II, was no dreamer. He was ruthlessly pragmatic, a man who understood that power does not arise from titles, but from organization, discipline, and force. From a fragmented kingdom, Philip forged Macedonia into an unprecedented machine of war. Long sarissa spears formed forests of steel. Dense phalanx formations advanced step by step, pushing back and subduing the Greek world itself. Alexander grew up immersed in this atmosphere, where ambition was breathed like air, where war was not a calamity, but the language of a new order. He was a prince, but he was not raised to indulge. He was raised to inherit an unfinished dream, the dream of unifying Greece, and beyond that, of challenging a vast empire rising in the East. This is not merely the story of a man who became great. It is the story of how power is planted, silently, patiently, within a child, until one day it grows strong enough to reject every limit placed before it. If you enjoy historical stories told slowly and softly, allowing you to drift gently into sleep, please support the channel Deep Sleep of Power by subscribing. Your support helps keep the whispered stories of history alive. And from here, as Alexander begins to learn how to see the world, not only through the eyes of a prince, but through the mind of a conqueror, the actual journey begins. Power never begins on the battlefield. It begins in silence, in thoughts repeated over and over, in stories told long enough, often enough, until a child can no longer tell where dreams end and destiny begins. Alexander grew up in such a world. From a very young age, he understood that he was different from other children, not because he was stronger or more intelligent, but because everyone around him behaved as if he had been born to carry something immense. The eyes that rested upon him did not linger on the present. They were always fixed on the future. Two currents shaped Alexander's mind, running side by side, opposing one another, yet constantly colliding. One flowed from his father, King Philip. The other was from his mother, Queen Olympias. Philip viewed the world through the eyes of a survivor. He did not believe in prophecies, nor did he trust in divine favor. To him, power was something to be built, step by step, through discipline, organization, and a cold understanding of human nature. He taught Alexander that victory does not come from courage alone, but from the ability to read one's opponent, to know when to advance, when to withdraw, and when to sacrifice without hesitation. But Olympias whispered entirely different things into her son's ear. She told him stories of Achilles, the greatest of heroes. She spoke of divine bloodlines, of dreams in which gods walked among mortals. Quietly but relentlessly, she planted a belief within Alexander. Her son was not born to live an ordinary life, and if fate had chosen him, then refusing that fate would itself be a sin. These two ways of seeing the world did not cancel each other out. They overlapped, and from that overlap emerged a singular inner world, a person at once coldly pragmatic and deeply intoxicated by the idea of immortal glory. Philip understood well the danger of dreams that grow too large, and so he decided to give Alexander an education that would keep his mind firmly anchored to the ground. When Alexander was 13 years old, Aristotle entered his life, not in a lavish palace, but in a quiet grove near Mieza. There were no thrones there, no soldiers, no applause, only books, questions, and long stretches of silence. Aristotle did not teach Alexander how to conquer the world. He taught him how to see it. He spoke of the order of nature, of cause and consequence, of how all things are bound together by invisible threads. He taught that a small action can produce vast effects, and that a ruler's decision never affects only one individual. More importantly, Aristotle taught Alexander to govern his own thoughts, not to let emotion overwhelm reason, not to allow anger to guide decisions. For a child raised on stories of gods and destiny, this restraint was a necessary counterweight. And yet even Aristotle could not prevent Alexander from keeping Homer's Iliad close at hand, as a book to rest beside his pillow. Within its epic lines, Alexander did not see only Achilles. He saw a model for himself, a man who accepted an early death in exchange for eternal fame, one who chose to be remembered forever rather than to live long in obscurity. And very early on, Alexander made that choice, though he never spoke it aloud. Gradually, a dangerous conviction took shape in his mind. Life only has meaning if it is grand enough to be retold. Ordinary limits were no longer barriers, but challenges. Time was not something to be savored, but something to be conquered as swiftly as possible. It was here that the seed of the Conqueror fully formed, not through weapons, not through armies, but through a way of thinking. The world exists to be rearranged, and if no one dares to do it, then the chosen one must. Yet even the sharpest mind remains theory until it is tested. Alexander was about to step out of the philosophical grove, to leave behind quiet lessons and measured thought, and to face the moment every prince must confront sooner or later, when power ceases to be an idea and becomes a real responsibility. At the age of 16, when his father departed the kingdom and entrusted him with rule, Alexander would learn for the first time a lesson no book could teach. Power does not wait for a person to grow up, and it would be then that the mind of a conqueror would be placed into the furnace of reality. There comes a moment in every life when all lessons come to an end, not because one has learned enough, but because life no longer has the patience to wait. For Alexander the Great, that moment arrived far earlier than for most. In 340 BCE, when Alexander was only 16 years old, King Philip left Macedonia to conduct a military campaign in the north. Before departing, he entrusted the governance of the kingdom to his son, not as a symbolic gesture, but as absolute authority, with all its risks and consequences. This was not a reward. It was a test. As the king departed from Pella, the entire kingdom seemed to hold its breath. A teenager now sat upon the throne of a rising power. A kingdom forged through war was placed in the hands of someone who had never commanded an army in real battle. Watchful eyes appeared everywhere, in the court, among the nobility, and most keenly beyond the borders. Power, once no longer shielded by the authority of the father, immediately became an invitation to rebellion. It did not take long. The Mede tribe of Thrace, hardy, warlike mountain fighters, seized the opportunity. They crossed the border, raided Macedonian settlements, believing that a young regent would hesitate, negotiate, or make fatal mistakes. They did not understand that Alexander had been raised in a world where hesitation meant defeat. When news of the raids reached Pella, Alexander did not convene a prolonged council. He did not send envoys to seek peace. He studied the maps, listened to the reports, and made a decision marked by his own distinct signature, not to react, but to reshape the situation itself. Instead of pursuing the Mede into their familiar mountains, where they held the advantage, Alexander focused on something few noticed: the rhythm of the enemy's life. The Mede were not merely warriors. They were a semi-nomadic people, dependent on seasonal routes and narrow passes linking the highlands. Alexander ordered those key points seized. There was no grand battle, no celebrated clash, only a series of precise, silent maneuvers, tightening like an invisible noose. By the time the Mede realized what was happening, they were cut off from supplies, from retreat, and from the very patterns that sustained their way of life. The uprising ended swiftly and brutally, yet the significance lay not in the outcome, but in the manner of action. This was the first time Alexander stood alone, no father behind him, no Aristotle to debate with, no Olympias whispering of destiny. There was only a young man, a kingdom awaiting protection, and a decision that had to be made immediately. After the victory, Alexander did not withdraw his forces. Instead, he did something that surprised many. He founded a new city, Alexandropolis, on the very land that had just been subdued. It was not merely a military fortress, but a statement, a reminder that power does not simply arrive and depart. It stays, takes root, and reshapes space itself. When King Philip returned, he did not merely find his kingdom intact. He found it expanded. More importantly, he saw in his son something that had previously existed only in theory: the capacity for independent action. Alexander was no longer an apprentice to power. He had touched it, and with that confidence came a new awareness. Alexander understood that power does not wait for perfect maturity. It arrives unexpectedly, demands immediate response, and punishes all hesitation. From that moment on, the world in his eyes was no longer divided into when I am ready and when I am not. There was only acting or being overtaken. The first regency gave Alexander more than experience. It gave him a deep and dangerous belief that he was ready. That age was no longer a barrier, that if a kingdom could be held at 16, then perhaps a continent, too, was merely a matter of circumstance. But power, once tasted, always demands more. Alexander was about to step onto a far, greater stage, one where mistakes could no longer be corrected in silence, and decisions would be etched into history. There, he would prove himself not merely to border tribes, but to the entire Greek world, in a battle that would temper him in blood and glory. That crucible was already waiting on the fields of Chaeronea. Power sometimes arrives like a cold wind. It does not knock, it does not ask permission, and it does not give the human heart time to prepare. If Chaeronea was the forge of the battlefield, then the moment Alexander draped himself in the king's cloak became the forge of something deeper still: the loneliness of the throne. In 336 BCE, Macedonia was radiant with celebration. The wedding of the princess, King Philip's daughter, was staged as a display of power. Guests from across the Greek world, generals, nobles, envoys, all were present to witness a dynasty at its peak. A kingdom once scorned now stood at the center of the Greek world, confident, unified, and seemingly unshakable. But history has a peculiar habit. It prefers to plant its fractures at the brightest moments. Amid the music, the footsteps, the cheers, a bodyguard approached King Philip. In a brief instant, so short that people heard only a sharp sound, like metal meeting flesh, the king collapsed. A blade, a fall, and the world changed color. Power, so recently built through discipline and victory, suddenly became as fragile as a glass vessel. Philip's death was not merely the death of a man. It was the disappearance of an anchor. It was an invitation sent to every enemy. Let us see whether Macedonia can stand once the lion has fallen. In the first hours after the assassination, the kingdom resembled a body whose heartbeat had been torn away. Inside the palace, familiar faces studied one another with guarded eyes. Outside the gates, rumors spread like fire in dry wind, and farther still, in the subdued Greek city-states, an old hope began to stir, cautiously yet eagerly. At the center of that storm, Alexander stood before his father's body. There was no time to weep, no space for weakness, only a cold question hanging in the air. Who would seize the cloak before it touched the ground? Alexander was only 20 years old. To the world, that was still the age of someone too young to bear a rising empire. But to Alexander, age had never been decisive. From Olympias, he had learned that destiny waits for no one. From Aristotle, he had learned that action creates consequence. And from Philip, he had learned the sharpest lesson of all. Power belongs to those who grasp it at the right moment. And Alexander grasped it. First, he went straight to the place that mattered most, the army, not the court, not councils thick with veiled words, but the soldiers, the men who held spears, who understood that a kingdom lives or dies not on parchment, but in the loyalty of those who defend it. Alexander stood before the generals and the troops. He did not need a long speech. Sometimes true power requires only one thing, a presence that does not tremble. His voice was calm, his gaze was steady, and he spoke as though the throne were not something he was asking for, but something that already belonged to him. In that moment, the army swore allegiance. Once loyalty was secured, Alexander began to do what every young ruler dreads learning. He learned how to cut away, not with emotion, but with calculation. For a throne is never an empty chair. It is a magnet for hidden ambitions, of nobles, of relatives, of those who believe blood alone grants them the right to contend. Alexander understood. If he delayed, civil war would follow. If he hesitated, Greece would rebel. If he softened, Macedonia would fracture. And so, he acted. Potential rivals were eliminated swiftly, quietly, without prolongation, like surgery performed in the night, precise, cold, and intolerant of error. Philip's power had been built on discipline. Alexander's power, on its very first day, was built on something more profound. Fear of collapse. There may have been a storm within him, but he did not allow it to show. It is said that during those days, Alexander once spoke to his closest companion, Hydaspes, as they walked through the royal gardens where he had once learned to think, dreamed of great deeds, and listened to birds instead of clashing spears. A king must be like a physician, Sometimes the cure requires cutting away diseased flesh, not out of cruelty, but out of love for the whole body. The words are both frightening and pitiful, for they reveal that Alexander had begun to see people as parts of a system, and when the system is threatened, emotion must step aside. That was the moment the king's cloak truly settled upon his shoulders, not through fabric, but through responsibility, through decisions that rob one of sleep, through the truth that, from now on, every step he took would carry the lives of thousands with it. Yet power, once secured, allows no rest. News of Philip's death spread to the Greek city-states, and there, old eyes began to gleam once more. People asked, does the lion's death mean the wolves are free? Does a young king have teeth sharp enough to keep Greece bowed? Alexander knew the answer could not lie in words. It had to be a message strong enough to extinguish every illusion of rebellion before it could ignite. And so, to the south, the first winds of resistance began to rise, especially from proud cities like Thebes. In the next part, you will see Alexander choose to answer not with negotiation, but with fire and ash. Power sometimes arrives like a cold wind. It does not knock, it does not ask permission, and it does not give the human heart time to prepare. If Chaeronea was the forge of the battlefield, then the moment Alexander draped himself in the king's cloak became the forge of something deeper still, the loneliness of the throne. In 336 BCE, Macedonia was radiant with celebration. The wedding of the princess, King Philip's daughter, was staged as a display of power. Guests from across the Greek world, generals, nobles, envoys, all were present to witness a dynasty at its peak. A kingdom once scorned now stood at the center of the Greek world, confident, unified, and seemingly unshakable. But history has a peculiar habit. It prefers to plant its fractures at the brightest moments. Amid the music, the footsteps, the cheers, a bodyguard approached King Philip. In a brief instant, so short that people heard only a sharp sound, like metal meeting flesh, the king collapsed, a blade, a fall, and the world changed color. Power, so recently built through discipline and victory, suddenly became as fragile as a glass vessel. Philip's death was not merely the death of a man. It was the disappearance of an anchor. It was an invitation sent to every enemy. Let us see whether Macedonia can stand once the lion has fallen. In the first hours after the assassination, the kingdom resembled a body whose heartbeat had been torn away. Inside the palace, familiar faces studied one another with guarded eyes. Outside the gates, rumors spread like fire in dry wind, and farther still, in the subdued Greek city-states, an old hope began to stir, cautiously yet eagerly. At the center of that storm, Alexander stood before his father's body. There was no time to weep, no space for weakness, only a cold question hanging in the air. Who would seize the cloak before it touched the ground? Alexander was only 20 years old. To the world, that was still the age of someone too young to bear a rising empire. But to Alexander, age had never been decisive. From Olympias, he had learned that destiny waits for no one. From Aristotle, he had learned that action creates consequence. And from Philip, he had learned the sharpest lesson of all. Power belongs to those who grasp it at the right moment. And Alexander grasped it. First, he went straight to the place that mattered most, the army, not the court, not councils thick with veiled words, but the soldiers, the men who held spears, who understood that a kingdom lives or dies not on parchment, but in the loyalty of those who defend it. Alexander stood before the generals and the troops. He did not need a long speech. Sometimes true power requires only one thing, a presence that does not tremble. His voice was calm, his gaze was steady, and he spoke as though the throne were not something he was asking for, but something that already belonged to him. In that moment, the army swore allegiance. Once loyalty was secured, Alexander began to do what every young ruler dreads learning. He learned how to cut away, not with emotion, but with calculation. For a throne is never an empty chair. It is a magnet for hidden ambitions, of nobles, of relatives, of those who believe blood alone grants them the right to contend. Alexander understood. If he delayed, civil war would follow. If he hesitated, Greece would rebel. If he softened, Macedonia would fracture. And so, he acted. Potential rivals were eliminated swiftly, quietly, without prolongation, like surgery performed in the night, precise, cold, and intolerant of error. Philip's power had been built on discipline. Alexander's power, on its very first day, was built on something more profound. Fear of collapse. There may have been a storm within him, but he did not allow it to show. It is said that during those days, Alexander once spoke to his closest companion, Hydaspes, as they walked through the royal gardens where he had once learned to think, dreamed of great deeds, and listened to birds instead of clashing spears. A king must be like a physician. Sometimes the cure requires cutting away diseased flesh, not out of cruelty, but out of love for the whole body. The words are both frightening and pitiful, for they reveal that Alexander had begun to see people as parts of a system, and when the system is threatened, emotion must step aside. That was the moment the king's cloak truly settled upon his shoulders, not through fabric, but through responsibility, through decisions that rob one of sleep, through the truth that, from now on, every step he took would carry the lives of thousands with it. Yet power, once secured, allows no rest. News of Philip's death spread to the Greek city-states, and there, old eyes began to gleam once more. People asked, does the lion's death mean the wolves are free? Does a young king have teeth sharp enough to keep Greece bowed? Alexander knew the answer could not lie in words. It had to be a message strong enough to extinguish every illusion of rebellion before it could ignite. And so, to the south, the first winds of resistance began to rise, especially from proud cities like Thebes. In the next part, you will see Alexander choose to answer not with negotiation, but with fire and ash. There are nights when power does not need to speak. It only needs to appear. And in that moment, every city, every heart that once nurtured hopes of resistance is forced to ask itself again, are we facing a young king or a storm? After Philip's death, the Greek world resembled a lake struck by a heavy stone. The ripples spread so quickly that no one could count them. In Athens, people began to speak of freedom as if rediscovering an old prayer. In Thebes, long-suppressed pride flared like embers beneath ash, suddenly fed by wind. And across the city-states, whispers traveled. Macedonia may be strong, but can a man of only 20 truly hold the reins tightening around all of Greece? Thebes answered that question first. The city that had once dared to confront Sparta, that prided itself on elite troops and an unbowed spirit, expelled the Macedonian garrison. It declared independence. It sent a signal to other cities, rise now. If Alexander hesitated even briefly, the fragile wall of alliances Philip had built would collapse. Alexander received the news like the sound of metal striking metal in the dark. He understood at once. This was not merely a revolt. It was a public test. If he softened, he would be devoured. If he delayed, Greece would ignite. If he negotiated, that negotiation would be read as weakness. And so he chose what young power often chooses to survive: speed. The Macedonian army marched south with such swiftness that many later said Alexander seemed not to travel across the land, but through the enemy's fear itself. Each step was a reminder. The new king was not confused. He would not wait for betrayal to become a movement. He arrived while it was still a small flame, so that he could extinguish it with the sky. When the Macedonian forces appeared before the gates of Thebes, the city's confidence began to tremble. The rebel leaders still tried to sound resolute, still believed in the miracle of a united Greece, still waited for Athens to send aid. But war does not wait for miracles. It waits only for the moment the defender realizes the calculation was wrong. Alexander did not come as a man eager for slaughter. At least on the surface, he still offered mercy, an exit, a narrow door through which Thebes could turn back. But Thebes chose to close that door. And when the door closed, history entered through violence. The siege did not last long. The walls, however strong, could not withstand the discipline and technique of an army Philip had forged into a machine. When a weakness appeared, Alexander ordered the assault. And once the city was breached, the fury that had built up within the Macedonian ranks, anger at defiance, anger at casualties, anger at the challenge, burst forth like a flood. Thebes was crushed, not merely captured, but erased. Houses collapsed, smoke rose, covering streets that had once shone with the pride of a great city-state. 30,000 people were captured and sold into slavery. An entire community was turned into a lesson, and amid those ashes, Alexander stood watching, a young king in the midst of a dead city. If you listen closely, you can sense that in that moment, Alexander was not only sending a message to Greece, he was also sending one to himself. I can do this. I can go to the very end of a decision. I can make a city disappear if it keeps the kingdom standing. But power always carries an invisible cost, and that cost does not always arrive immediately in the form of rebellion or war. Sometimes it comes in the silence of the inner world. When you order a city to become ash, you do not only burn its houses, you also burn away a part of your own capacity for softness. You teach yourself that cruelty can be a tool, and once a tool proves effective, it easily becomes a habit. Many sources later claimed that Alexander regretted Thebes. Perhaps it is true, perhaps not. But regardless, the destruction achieved what it needed to achieve. Greece fell silent. Athens, instead of rising, chose to send envoys. Other city-states swiftly pledged loyalty. The Greek League was restored under Alexander's authority, not through affection, but through an unspoken understanding. Do not test this young man. The fire of Thebes became a signal beacon for the entire peninsula. The new order had found its master, and once Greece had been forced into stillness, Alexander turned back to a greater dream. The dream Philip had kindled like a sacred flame, to cross the sea into Asia, to confront Persia, to turn war not merely into conquest, but into epic. Yet before stepping into Asia, Alexander needed a rite, a mark, an act to tell the world that this was not merely a king's campaign, but a crossing of history itself. The smoke of Thebes still lingered in memory as he looked toward the sea. And in the next part, you will see him stand before the Hellespont, a narrow stretch of water dividing two continents, and cast his spear toward the opposite shore, as if hurling his very fate into Asia. After fire and ash, there is often silence. Greece had fallen into such silence, not because of agreement, but because it understood that sometimes power does not need argument to be correct. It only needs enough force to make everyone stop speaking. And within that quiet, Alexander turned toward the horizon. Where sea meets sky lies a fragile boundary, a narrow stretch of water that, in the ancient imagination, was as vast as fate itself. The Hellespont. The Hellespont was not merely a strait. It was a cut across the map of the mind. On one side lay Europe, the familiar world, where every stone had a name and every city-state a memory. On the other hand lies Asia, the land of exaggerated tales, unimaginable wealth, and the Persian Empire stretching like a colossal dream. For many, crossing the Hellespont meant stepping into danger. For Alexander, crossing it meant stepping into destiny. In the spring of 334 BCE, the Macedonian army gathered at Amphipolis. 35,000 men, soldiers forged into a single body, sharing one breath, one rhythm of footsteps, and one belief that they were following a man born to lead them where no one had gone before. On the night before the crossing, imagine hearing the distant sound of waves, steady, patient. They did not urge. They merely repeated, like history itself, always waiting to see whether human beings dare to step beyond fear. Alexander stood on the shore. The land beneath his feet was Europe. The water before him was the boundary, and the far shore, hazy, was Asia. He was not preparing merely a campaign. He was preparing a rite. When his ship touched the opposite shore, Alexander performed an act both unforgettable and straightforward. He took his spear, the symbol of war and power, and hurled it toward the land. A short arc, a soft impact against the soil, but in the minds of the thousands watching, it was a throw that shook an entire age. With that gesture, Alexander told the world, and perhaps told himself, that this land was no longer foreign. It had become a prize, a stage, and he, stepping down from the ship, was placing himself into the role of an epic hero. Here, one can sense something profoundly deep sleep of power. Power does not rely on force alone. It requires symbols. People do not fight merely for pay or command. They fight for a story that convinces them they are part of something greater than themselves. Alexander understood this early, from Olympias, from Aristotle, from Homer, and from the solitude of the throne itself. And so, before confronting Persian satraps and real armies, Alexander led his troops to Troy. Troy, the ancient city where legend said Achilles fought and died. To an ordinary man, Troy was only ruins. But to Alexander, it was a mirror, a place to glimpse the figure he wished to become. There are pilgrimages not meant to seek the divine, but to find a version of oneself large enough to leave fear behind. It is said that Alexander visited the tomb of Achilles, performed rituals, and ran around the grave as a way of connecting the current with the heroic past. The act was at once almost childish and profoundly calculated. It declared that this war was not merely an invasion. It was the next chapter of the Iliad, and Alexander, within that story, did not wish to be a supporting figure. He wanted to be the protagonist. Yet beneath the myth lay an apparent reality. Alexander was crafting for himself a psychological armor, a shell within which he no longer had to ask, "Am I capable?" but only, "How must I act so that destiny unfolds as it has been told?" In those days, one can imagine Alexander standing between two worlds. One foot still belonged to Macedonia, discipline, tactics, The phalanx, sarissa spears like forests of steel. The other had stepped into the world of symbols, Achilles, prophecy, and the conviction of being chosen. It was this combination that made him dangerous, for a man with only tactics can be defeated. A man with only myth can awaken from illusion, but a man who possesses both tactics and myth is one who can draw an entire age along behind him. Asia, however, was not a blank page. In the western reaches of the Persian Empire, the satraps had heard the news. They knew a young king was coming, and they knew that if he were allowed to advance, cities, treasures, and the prestige of Persia itself would begin to tremble. They gathered forces, chose their ground, and prepared for the first battle. A battle that would decide whether the cast spear was an empty rite or the true opening line of a new epic. Alexander had stepped onto Asian soil, but to keep that ground, he would have to answer with blood. And in the next part, the Granicus River awaits, another boundary, not between continents, but between confidence and death. There, Alexander would learn for the first time that Asia was not merely the prize of prophecy, but a trial that could end his life on the very first day. There are rivers that are not large, yet are deep in another way, deep in the memory of those who crossed them. The Granicus was such a river. After the ritual of casting the spear into Asia, after the pilgrimage to Troy to touch the shadow of Achilles, Alexander finally faced what every legend must confront sooner or later: reality. Reality does not care about destiny. Reality asks only one cold question: will you live to see tomorrow? On the opposite bank of the Granicus, the Persian satraps were already waiting. They were not vague figures from stories. They were seasoned governors of the greatest empire in the world, men accustomed to command, to taxation, to suppressing revolt. And now they stood on the high bank, looking down at the river as one looks down into a trap. The Granicus was not especially wide, but it was wide enough to disrupt formation. Its banks were steep and slippery, ensuring that any army attempting to cross would be slowed, fragmented, and exposed, perfect targets for Persian cavalry. It was a shrewd defensive position, a position chosen to turn a river crossing into chaos. Parmenion, the veteran general, who had seen too many battlefields to trust recklessness, approached Alexander and spoke with caution. He advised waiting and camping and finding a way to cross at dawn when conditions might be more favorable. To Parmenion, this was too great a gamble to stake everything on a single moment. But Alexander saw the river differently. To him, the Granicus was not merely an obstacle. It was an opportunity to send his first message in Asia: I have not come here to hesitate. What does a young conqueror need most on the first day? Not territory, not treasure, but belief. The belief of his soldiers that they were following a man without fear. The enemy believed that they faced something unpredictable, and the belief of Alexander himself that destiny, long spoken of, would not end at a riverbank. And so, he ordered the attack at once. Imagine the scene as if in slow motion. The current swirling gently, the steep banks, the sound of hooves striking stone. Alexander is at the front, not hidden behind the shields of his generals, not standing safely back to observe. He led the companion cavalry, the elite horsemen of Macedonia, straight into the water. There is something peculiar about men like Alexander. They use danger as a language. In war, not everyone listens to reason, but everyone listens to images, and the image of a young king plunging into the river first carries the force of an oath that cannot be withdrawn. The clash erupted in the river, And on the far bank, Persian cavalry surged down like a rain of steel, thrusts, metal striking metal, men falling from saddles, water splashing upward, all merged into a sound history later calls a battle, but to those within it, it was simply a single, unending moment of survival. Amid the chaos, Alexander nearly died. 2 Persian nobles closed in on him. A sword swung down, aimed straight at his head. And in that instant, every legend could have ended just like that. No next chapter, no burning of Persepolis, no Alexandria, no Gaugamela. Only a young king died on a riverbank in his first battle. But history sometimes turns on the loyalty of a single person. Clytus the Black, Alexander's childhood companion, a soldier who had grown up alongside him, rushed forward. One stroke, the attacker's arm was severed, and Alexander lived. If you look closely at that moment, you will see a profound psychological truth. Alexander's power, however vast, was still preserved by the thinnest of human threads. A friend's sword, a split-second decision, an unwavering loyalty. And that is what makes power terrifying. It is not only the will of one man, it is a network of people who believe in that man. The battle turned decisively when the Macedonian phalanx managed to cross the river. If the cavalry was the blade, the phalanx was the wall. The long sarissa spears formed a forest of steel, advancing slowly, steadily, and impenetrably. The steep bank ceased to be an advantage. It became the place where Persian forces were pushed back, lost formation, lost breath. The Persian line collapsed. Victory belonged to Macedonia, but every victory has its shadow. After the Granicus, Alexander treated the Greek mercenaries who had fought for Persia with calculated harshness. In his eyes, they were not merely enemies, they were traitors to the Greek cause itself. And so, he ordered severe punishment, an act that was morally justified within his own logic, and at the same time a political message. No one can stand between 2 worlds without paying a price. Thus ended the Granicus, a small river, a great victory, a near death, and a first mark upon Asian soil. Yet what mattered most was what happened inside Alexander after the battle. A man who has seen death from the distance of a single breath is changed. He may become more humble, or he may become more dangerous, believing himself to have been spared. And when a person believes they have been spared by fate, they begin to think they are permitted to go farther than anyone else. Alexander left the Granicus with eyes that may have burned brighter, but also colder. He knew he was not immortal, yet he also knew he could survive what others called impossible. The road into Asia Minor now lay open. Cities would surrender, fortresses would be besieged, and symbols would appear one by one, like markers along the path of a man writing his own prophecy. And in the next part, Alexander will encounter a knot not found on the battlefield, but in the imagination of all Asia, the Gordian knot. An ancient prophecy will stand before him, asking a silent question. Does his power come from obeying fate, or from daring to cut fate apart with the edge of his sword? After the Granicus, the world did not change at once, but it began to tilt. Gates that had once been closed to the Macedonians now opened in a strange silence, the silence of cities weighing honor against survival. Across Asia Minor, news traveled faster than marching feet. The young king had crossed the river, had won a battle, had nearly died, and had lived. And when such a story is told, it does more than carry information. It carries a feeling, the sense that a force is advancing, one not easily stopped. Alexander understood this clearly. The first victory is a key. But a key opens only the first door. Beyond it stretches a long corridor of choices. What to take first, what to leave for later, where the true centers lie, and what is merely noise. And so his march through Asia Minor was not simply a chain of battles. It resembled a hand turning the pages of an immense book. Each page, a city, a harbor, a fortress. Sardis surrendered with almost no bloodshed, as though the city itself wished to change masters gently, to avoid the storm. Coastal towns like Miletus and Halicarnassus were different. They forced Alexander to stop, to lay siege, to prove that he could not only win a single battle, but also break formidable walls. For a conqueror, this is the most uncomfortable discipline of all. Slowing down. Ambition always wants to move quickly, but an empire must move securely. In those days, Alexander began to learn a new lesson about power. It does not always come from a decisive blow. Sometimes power comes from the willingness to remain before a wall for a few more weeks, simply to tell the world, I have time, I have patience, and I have the resolve not to abandon anything I have begun. Yet amid this chain of military events, there was a moment that did not belong directly to the battlefield, and yet reached more deeply than any clash of arms into Alexander's mind. That moment lay in a city called Gordium. Gordium was not famous for its army. It was renowned for a small object, an ancient chariot, and a knot. The Gordian knot. It was said that the rope binding the chariot was tied in such a complex manner that no one could find its ends, and a prophecy whispered that whoever could undo the knot would become ruler of all Asia. In an empire as vast as Persia, such a prophecy might have been mere folklore, but for Alexander, raised on stories of Achilles, on the idea of being chosen, prophecy was never just a story. It was a mirror. It stood before him and asked, "Who are you? A fortunate king, or the one destiny has prepared for the throne of an entire continent?" You can imagine Alexander entering the place where the chariot was kept, light falling on the rope. The air is still, the eyes of generals, soldiers, and local people, all waiting. In that moment, this was no longer a riddle. It was an examination set by history itself. He stepped forward, touched the knot, tried to loosen it. It would not yield. He tried again. Still nothing. Here, deep sleep of power often reveals something profoundly human. Even a conqueror can be rendered powerless by an inanimate piece of rope. And it is in such moments that one sees a person's true nature most clearly. Alexander could not tolerate being bound by complexity, not simply because he lacked patience, but because he did not see the world as a maze to be solved step by step. He saw it as an object that could be cut if it blocked the way. And so he drew his sword. One stroke. The rope was severed, not untied in the traditional sense, but opened in the sense that mattered most to Alexander, turning the impossible into something that had happened. That moment read like a declaration of his method of living. When a problem is too complex, change the rules. When the maze is too tangled, break the wall. When fate poses a riddle, answer with action. Those who witnessed it may have exhaled, half in astonishment, half in relief. For though the act was controversial, it produced exactly what Alexander needed, a sign. From that point on, in the minds of the Macedonian army, the prophecy had been fulfilled. And when an army believes it marches with the chosen one, it can endure longer, go farther, and suffer more without breaking. But prophecy also carries a price. For once you begin to believe that the world must belong to you, every obstacle ceases to be a challenge and becomes an affront. Pride, then, is no longer merely a motive. It becomes a demand that must be satisfied. While Alexander was cutting the Gordian knot, fate elsewhere was also cutting away a danger for him. In the Aegean Sea, Memnon of Rhodes, the gifted Persian commander who might have made Alexander's campaign far more difficult through naval power, suddenly died of illness. The news reached Alexander like an unseen wind lifting a shadow from his path. History is not only the triumph of genius, it is also a sequence of doors that happen to open at the right time. And once Gordium had become a marker of prophecy, once the coastal cities had been steadily neutralized, Alexander turned his gaze farther east. No longer the familiar lands of Asia Minor, no longer the coasts where one could feel the Mediterranean wind. Ahead lay the vast interior, where Persia was no longer a distant shadow, but a colossal body awakening. There, Darius III, the King of Kings, was assembling a great army, determined to crush the young invader. Granicus had been a greeting. Gordium is a symbol. The actual confrontation was drawing near, and in the next part, Alexander will step into a geographic trap, a narrow coastal plain where the Persians attempt to use their numbers to suffocate him. The place was called Issus. There, Alexander would see Darius for the first time, and would understand for the first time that power does not lie merely in winning battles, but in making another king run. There are battles not decided by numbers, not decided by weapons, but decided by a fragile moment, the moment when one heart falters and one chariot turns. Issus was such a place. After Gordium, after the coastal cities fell one by one, Alexander pressed deeper inland with a sensation that was at once calm and taut as a drawn bowstring. Quiet, because the chain of victories had led the army to believe they were walking a path already destined. Tense, because ahead were no longer local satraps. Ahead stood Darius III, the King of Kings, a man whose name was bound to the very idea of the Persian Empire. On a map, Persia appeared as a sea of color so vast, it made any individual feel small. But on the battlefield, every empire must take the shape of a single person, and Darius chose to bring that shape to Issus. In a bold maneuver, Darius did not wait for Alexander to come to him. He marched around behind, cutting the Macedonian supply lines and lines of retreat. It was an attack, not meant to win immediately, but to unnerve, to tell Alexander, "You have no way back." When Alexander grasped the situation, he turned like a hunted predator challenged at close range. But Issus was not a vast plain where Persian numbers could spread like a sea. It was a narrow coastal strip, squeezed between mountains and water. That very geography did something strange. It suffocated Persian strength. The army was vast, but had no space to breathe. The two armies deployed facing one another in an atmosphere so dense it seemed possible to hear metal trembling before it struck. At the center of the Persian army, Darius appeared in splendor upon his royal chariot. Gold, silk, bodyguards, standards, symbols of ancient authority, all meant to remind the world that he was not merely a king. He was the summit of a system. Opposite him, Alexander stood among his soldiers. No lavish display, only focused eyes, and the silence of men preparing to rush into death as a task to be done. The battle began not with shouts, but with movement. Alexander commanded the right wing, where he habitually placed himself in the most dangerous position, as if power had to be proven by proximity to death. Parmenion held the left, solid, dense, enduring. In the center, the Macedonian phalanx advanced, slowly, like a living wall. But Issus was not a place where Alexander intended to win in pieces. He sought to finish with a single thrust to the heart. He saw what few perceived in the chaos. In every army, the heart does not lie in numbers. The heart lies in the presence of the leader. If Darius broke, Persia would break, and Alexander aimed at Darius. His companion cavalry surged forward as a spear was hurled straight ahead. No circling, no hesitation. In those seconds, war felt like a violent dream in which every sound stretched unnaturally. The breathing of horses, the clash of armor, the cries of men, and then the rattle of the royal chariot's wheels as the point drew near. Darius saw Alexander, not an army, a young man charging directly toward him, as if nothing else in the world mattered. And in that instant, the strangest thing occurred. The King of Kings fled. The chariot turned. The attendants fell into confusion. The standards wavered, and the news flashed through the Persian ranks like lightning. The king had withdrawn. Nothing shatters morale faster than the image of the leader turning his back. An army can endure casualties, hunger, and even minor defeats. But when the symbol of order runs, that order turns to sand. The Persian army collapsed. The empire became a vast rout, where the immense strength of an empire dissolved into a panicked mass, trampling itself in flight. But Alexander did not merely win a battle. He captured Darius's family, his mother, his wife, his children. In the ancient world, this was the ultimate prize, a means to humiliate the enemy, to force an empire to kneel through pain. And here, Alexander did something that makes history pause and look more closely. He treated them with respect, not because he was soft, but because he understood power on a higher level. Power is not only about making others fear you, it is also making it impossible for them to hate you in a simple way. It is said that Darius's mother, Sisygambis, mistook Hephaestion, Alexander's closest companion, for the king because of his stature and bearing. When she apologized in distress, Alexander gently replied, "You were not mistaken, for he too is Alexander." A simple sentence, yet rich with craft. He elevated his friend as part of himself, while lowering the boundary between victor and vanquished. It was how he compelled his enemies to see him as a ruler, not merely a plunderer. In that moment, one can sense two faces of Alexander existing at once. A man who could charge toward death without hesitation, and a man who understood that lasting victory requires the legitimacy of honor. Issues, therefore, were not merely a battle. It was a psychological turning point. From here, Alexander knew he could do what seemed impossible: make Darius flee. And once a man has tasted such a victory, it is difficult to return to moderation. He begins to believe that every limit is merely something not yet broken. Yet Alexander made a strategic decision that appeared unusual. He did not pursue Darius immediately. Instead of rushing to end the war, he turned south toward the coastal cities. Many might call this hesitation. In truth, it was a calculation of power. If the Phoenician coast was not secured, Persia could still use its navy to sever supply lines, turning the conquest into a wound that never stopped bleeding. Alexander chose to control the arteries before striking the heart, and thus the march would lead him to a city standing between land and sea, a fortress deemed impregnable. Its name was Tyre. In the next part, you will see Alexander face a challenge not of speed or decisive blows, but of endurance stretched across 7 months, where power must prove that it can win not only through force, but by reshaping the very geography of the world itself. There are enemies who do not stand on the battlefield. They remain still, they are silent, and they speak in stone. Tyre was such an enemy. After Issus, Alexander had proven something that seemed impossible. He had made Darius flee. Yet Alexander understood clearly that great victories often open the door to even greater risks. With his opponent retreating eastward, the rest of the Persian Empire still remained, especially its naval power, which could turn any land conquest into an endless war. To advance deeper into Asia without having his supply lines severed, Alexander had to do something that sounded tedious but was vital: secure the Phoenician coast. Many cities surrendered. They saw the direction history was taking and chose survival. They opened their gates, offered tribute, and accepted a new order that at least allowed them to endure. But one city refused to bow: Tyre, an island about half a mile offshore, protected by towering walls rising straight out of the sea. From a distance, Tyre looked like a sealed gemstone, beautiful, cold, and confident in its invulnerability. Supplies arrived by ship. Communication traveled by water, and in the ancient world, where sieges usually depended on cutting land routes, Tyre was a fortress, built by the sea itself. The people of Tyre believed the sea was their ally. They rejected Alexander's demand. They believed the young king might win battles on land, but against the sea, against walls, against time, he would be worn down. They misunderstood one thing: Alexander was not the kind of conqueror who lived on just enough victories. He lived by breaking the word impossible, then placing its fragments beneath his feet as trophies. When Tyre closed its gates, Alexander did not withdraw, nor did he rush into a futile assault. He stood and looked at the city in silence, as if facing another riddle placed before him by fate. And within that silence, an idea took shape. An idea so audacious that, spoken aloud, beforehand, it would have sounded like a dream. He would turn the island into land. Alexander ordered the construction of a massive causeway, a mole, stretching from the shore to the island, built of stone, timber, and earth. Thousands of soldiers began hauling rocks. Stones dropped into the sea, sank, and became the foundation for more stones. Day after day, week after week, the causeway crept farther outward, like a hand reaching for what seemed unreachable. This was the moment when war transformed into something else, a war of patience. There were no explosive moments, like Issus, no decisive thrust at the center. Only labor, sweat, and piles were driven into the sea, and in deep sleep of power. This is a singular moment. Power is not always blazing fire. Sometimes it is repetition, day after day, step by step, until the world itself is reshaped by the will of one person. But Tyre did not remain passive. From the walls, they fired arrows. They hurled stones. They launched ships to attack the workers building the causeway. Each time the structure rose, waves of destruction followed. Then, in a bold act, the Tyrians sent Alexander a message written in fire. They set a ship packed with combustible materials ablaze and drove it into the works, burning the newly built section to ash. In that moment, many commanders might have thought, enough. But Alexander looked at the ashes as a personal challenge. He did not stop. He rebuilt. And this time, he built wider, stronger, more enduring. If the Granicus had shown that Alexander could risk his life, if Issus had demonstrated that he could strike at the psychology of an empire, then Tyre showed something even more frightening: an inexhaustible persistence. 7 months. In the ancient world, 7 months was long enough for an army to lose heart, for disease to spread, for soldiers to begin asking, "Why are we here?" but Alexander kept them from asking in a way that was uniquely his own. He turned the siege into a mission. He turned every stone carried into the sea into a step of destiny. At last, when the causeway reached the base of the walls, the rhythm changed. Siege towers were pushed forward. Alexander's fleet, assembled from coastal cities that had already submitted, coordinated attacks from multiple directions. And when a weakness appeared, the Macedonians poured in like water. Tyre fell, and as usual, the price of defying Alexander was horrific. The city was devastated. Many inhabitants were killed. Tens of thousands were sold into slavery. If Thebes had been a message to Greece, Tyre was a message driven straight into the heart of the Persian world. Do not believe that sea or walls can save you from my will. Yet on a deeper level, Tyre also left its mark on Alexander's mind. For when you have altered geography itself, when you have pulled land into the sea through sheer resolve, you begin to believe that the world can be not only conquered, but remade. And that belief, once large enough, does not stop at victory. It seeks something else: legitimacy, sacred confirmation, a sign from the most ancient lands that Alexander was not merely powerful, but recognized. After Tyre, the coastal road lay open. The eastern Mediterranean was in his grasp, and to the south, a land older even than Greece awaited: Egypt, the land of pharaohs, pyramids, and gods whose names were so ancient that even time seemed to bow to them. In the next part, Alexander will enter Egypt not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, then journey deep into the desert to Siwa, where he will hear another calling, not from the battlefield, but from the divine son of Amun. There are victories that require no sword, no blood, only belief. After 7 months before Tyre, where stone had been forced to learn how to float upon the sea, Alexander turned south. The coastal road along the Mediterranean opened gently, as if the land itself had grown weary of resistance. And then he entered Egypt. Here, there were no alarm trumpets, no sealed gates, only crowds that first stood in silence, then suddenly erupted, like a breath finally released after years of being held tight. To the Egyptians, the Persians were not merely rulers. They were the memory of a prolonged humiliation. And so, when Alexander the Great appeared, he was not seen as an invader, but as an exit. In Memphis, ancient rituals were performed. Alexander donned the crown of the pharaoh, not as a performance, but as legitimation. He honored the gods, preserved traditions, and spoke the language of power that Egypt understood: continuity, order, and the sacred. Yet Alexander did not come to Egypt merely to be exalted. He came to position himself. At the mouth of the Nile, where the wind carried salt and light fractured across the water, Alexander traced the outline of a new city, Alexandria. Not simply a fortress, but a bridge between Greece and Egypt, between sea and river, between knowledge and commerce. Here, power would not reside solely in palaces, but would spread through books, harbors, and encounters of ideas. Alexandria was a promise of a world that could be blended, and it was also a sign that Alexander had begun to think like one who would remain, not merely pass through. Yet amid rituals and maps, another impulse pulled him away from the fertile river, an impulse rising from deep within, where Olympias's stories, Homer's verses, and successive victories had layered upon one another like sand. Alexander wanted to know, who am I, truly? And so, he turned his back on the forming city and led a small party into the desert. No display, no grand army, only wind, sand, and a vague direction toward the oasis of Siwa, where the temple of Amun stood like a surviving memory from the most ancient age. The journey was not for the faint of heart. The desert is not hostile, but it is indifferent. It allows humans to confront their limits: scorching sun, disorienting sands, and nights so silent that thoughts echo louder than footsteps. It is said that Alexander's party lost its way, that they were guided by strange signs, birds, winds, or rare rains. History is uncertain, but in deep sleep of power, what matters is not how it happened, but that Alexander believed it did. When a person has won too many victories, they begin to seek another kind of triumph, victory over doubt within themselves. Siwa appeared like an oasis of silence. The temple of Amun was not grand in spectacle, but heavy with time. Its walls had heard too many prayers to be surprised by any king. And then, within the sacred chamber, Alexander entered, alone, or with very few others. What was said there, history does not record, and perhaps it should not. What is known is that when Alexander emerged, his face had changed, not with joy, but with certainty. The priests proclaimed him the son of Zeus Amun, a god in human form. To the modern world, this may appear as political theater. To Egypt, it was religious legitimation. To Alexander, it was a key that unlocked a door beyond which he was no longer merely king of Macedonia, no longer simply the victor of Issus or Tyre. He was one who had been named by the divine, a man whose victories were not only rational, but expected. Here, a thin boundary appeared within the psychology of power. When you believe you are chosen, responsibility can transform into a mission, and mission, if unchecked, demands absolute submission from the world. Alexander returned to Egypt with the bearing of a man who had found the answer he needed, not an answer for others, for himself. From this point on, rituals, titles, victories, all would line up behind a single central idea. I am not merely permitted to win, I must win. But sanctified power carries a danger of its own. It renders failure unacceptable. It turns hesitation into offense, and it transforms every subsequent battle into a test of divinity. To the east, Darius III did not rest. He was gathering every remaining resource of the empire: cavalry from the steppes, infantry from the provinces, scythed chariots, to wager everything on one final battle. A battle not merely to win, but to refute the story of the chosen one. Alexander left Egypt carrying a new belief, deeper and more dangerous. He turned northward toward the open plains, where numbers would face will. And in the next part, at Gaugamela, the fate of an empire would be placed upon the table, not to be debated, but to be decided by a single charge into the very center of history. There are mornings when the ground itself seems to know what is about to happen. The wind softens, the air stands still, and silence takes the shape of a verdict. Gaugamela was such a morning. After Egypt and Siwa, Alexander the Great returned north with a new conviction, not loud, but deep and hard as stone. He spoke little of the gods, yet in the way he studied the maps, in the way he arranged his formations, one could sense something unmistakable. Alexander believed he had arrived at history's appointed meeting place. Across the plain, Darius III believed the same. After 2 defeats, the King of Kings had no choice but to place everything on the table. He gathered at Gaugamela all that the Persian Empire could muster: cavalry from the steppes, infantry from distant provinces, war elephants and scythed chariots, designed to tear enemy ranks apart. Darius even ordered the ground leveled, so that no unevenness would hinder the wheels of death. This was the power of an empire, driven into a corner, vast, numerous, terrifying, and confident that sheer numbers would, in the end, crush any genius. Alexander looked upon that plain without trembling. He knew he was outnumbered. He also knew that Gaugamela was unlike Issus. There were no mountains or sea to suffocate the Persian formation. This was a place where numbers could breathe. And so, Alexander did not seek a direct collision. He sought to bend the direction of force. On the night before the battle, Alexander walked along the ranks. No rousing cries, no long speeches, only brief words, enough to remind each man why he stood there. Then he slept, a deep, tranquil sleep, as if the next day were merely a task to be completed, not a gamble with fate. At dawn, he deployed an oblique formation, a subtle arrangement designed to draw Persian cavalry away from the center. The phalanx stood in the middle, dense, solid, like a living wall. Reserve units waited behind to seal any breaches when the chariots struck. And on the right wing, Alexander positioned himself where the decisive blow would be delivered. The battle began with the trembling of the earth. The scythed chariots charged forward. But instead of panic, the Macedonian ranks opened at precisely the right moment. Like a calculated doorway, the chariots passed through, lost momentum, and became useless. Persian cavalry surged toward the flanks, attempting encirclement, and precisely as Alexander had foreseen, a gap opened near the center, where Darius stood. At that moment, Alexander did not hesitate. He led the companion cavalry into the opening like a wedge. He did not seek prolonged engagement. He did not aim to win piece by piece. There was a single objective: the heart. As at Issus, Alexander understood that Persian power was bound to the presence of the king. If Darius broke, the entire system would break with him. Darius saw the wedge advancing. For the second time in his life, he saw Alexander. And for the second time, the chariot turned. That moment, small, swift, yet heavy as iron, toppled an empire. When the symbol of order leaves the center, order fractures into pieces. The Persian army began to withdraw. Withdrawal became flight. Flight became chaos, men trampling one another to escape. Yet Gaugamela did not end with a triumphant pursuit. On the left wing, Parmenion was under severe pressure. Messages reached Alexander, and here, power revealed another face: choice. Alexander could continue the pursuit of Darius, finish the enemy, end the war on the spot. Or he could turn back, save the left wing, save the men who had marched with him every step of the way. Alexander turned his horse. That decision, forsaking the chance to capture Darius, was not weakness. It was a quiet declaration that his power did not rest solely on personal victory, but on loyalty. He won the battle, but he did not trade human lives for symbols. As the sun sank low, Gaugamela was decided. Persia was utterly defeated. There was no doubt, no possibility of reversal. The empire that had dominated Western Asia for centuries had lost its backbone. The road lay open: Babylon, with gates wide as a welcome; Susa, with treasures piled high like memory; Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Themistocles, awaits judgment. Gaugamela was not merely the most significant battle. It was the breaking point of ancient history, where an empire ended, not through the deaths of millions, but through a single king turning his back before a charging wedge. For Alexander, however, this victory also closed another chapter, the chapter of proving that he could defeat Persia. From this point onward, the question was no longer who is stronger, but who rules. And that is a different question. deeper and more difficult, for conquest is not the same as rule. To shatter is not the same as to preserve. And as Alexander entered the eastern capitals as a liberator, he would soon discover that power, once it no longer faces an equal rival, begins to test its holder in far subtler ways. In the next part, Alexander will take on a new title, Lord of Asia, and face the first proper choice of the victor, revenge or inheritance. There comes a moment after every great victory, when the clash of metal fades, when dust settles from armor, and the actual question begins to echo, not from the defeated, but from the victor himself. What will I do with the world that has just opened before me? After Gaugamela, that question stood before Alexander the Great like a colossal gate. The road into Babylon unfolded not through fear, but through flowers. The city, hub of trade routes, of astronomy, of ancient temples, received him as a liberator. Alexander entered without haste. He allowed the rituals to proceed, allowed the city's breath to align with his own steps. Here, power did not need to be displayed. It needed to be acknowledged. At the Temple of Marduk, he performed the traditional rites. He did not destroy. He did not offend. This was a deeply calculated choice. Alexander understood that an empire cannot endure by the sword alone. It needs roots, religious roots, customary roots, roots of memory, to anchor itself in lands inhabited long before his arrival. From Babylon to Susa, the treasures opened like whispers of time. Gold was not merely wealth. It was the accumulated memory of Persian power across generations. Alexander did not allow that treasure to scatter. He recorded it, distributed it, and preserved order. People began to call him by a new title, not Conqueror, but Lord of Asia. Yet amid the opened gates and solemn ceremonies, Alexander also faced a silent resistance to reign and pride. At the Persian gate, a small Persian force blocked his way amid treacherous mountains. They were not numerous enough to win, but determined enough to delay. For weeks, Alexander maneuvered through fog, narrow passes, and sudden strikes, a reminder that even with its backbone broken, the empire still had muscles that twitched. When that gate finally fell, Persepolis emerged, the ceremonial heart of Persia. And here, Alexander stood before the most challenging choice since crossing the Hellespont: inheritance or revenge. Persepolis was the memory of Athenian temples burned a century and a half earlier. It was the symbol of a dynasty that had once humiliated Greece. On a fateful night, fire was set. The palace of Xerxes burned, not merely wood and stone, but an era. The act was both symbolic and cathartic. It told the world that the old order had ended. Yet when the ashes settled, Alexander did not revel in victory. He looked upon the ruins like a wound, necessary, but painful. From this point on, he was no longer an outsider. He was the heir, and an heir must carry both the light and the shadow of what he inherits. News arrived from the east. Darius had been betrayed. Bessus, a satrap, had killed the king and proclaimed himself ruler. When Alexander found Darius's body, he ordered a burial with royal honors. This was not spontaneous mercy. It was a message: I do not kill kings. I punish those who kill kings. Through that ritual, Alexander placed himself within the legitimate line of Persian authority, not as a destroyer, but as a successor. From that moment, the empire opened in a different way, not only through fear, but through order. Alexander retained many Persian officials, preserved the tax system, and respected local laws. At the same time, he installed Macedonians and Greeks in key positions. a deliberate interweaving designed to force two worlds to learn how to breathe together. But every union carries resistance. For the Macedonians who had followed him from Pella to Gaugamela, seeing their king wear Eastern dress, adopt Eastern rituals, and speak in the language of the East was a shock to identity. They had conquered Persia to defeat it, not to become it. Alexander felt that tension acutely. He stood between two shores. On one side, the vast dream of unification. On the other, the loyalty of those who had bled alongside him. As Lord of Asia, he could no longer choose only one shore. He had to balance both. Power at this stage was no longer about speed. It was about depth. Every decision, who held office, which rituals were preserved, what garments were worn, became political. Alexander learned to rule like a conductor, where each instrument must enter at the right moment for the harmony not to collapse. Yet even then, an old impulse returned. With no equal rival remaining in the West, Alexander's gaze turned farther east, toward restless mountain provinces, toward local leaders who had not yet accepted the new order. There, war would no longer be a series of grand battles, but a succession of minor grinding cuts, a different trial of power. The Lord of Asia left Persepolis not amid cheers, but in quiet concentration. He carried both gold and burden, both glory and doubt. And he knew that from this point forward, victory would not come from a single decisive wedge, but from the capacity to endure a prolonged conflict, one in which loyalty would be tested, identity eroded, and the man himself would be worn down. In the next part, Alexander will enter the mountains of Bactria and Sogdiana, where war changes shape, where friends become burdens, and where power begins to question itself. There is an illusion that often accompanies great victory, that from this point onward, everything will become easier. But history rarely grants anyone a straight road. After Persepolis, after the treasures of Susa, after the title Lord of Asia, Alexander entered the more dangerous phase of power, the phase no longer radiant, no longer marked by flower-strewn gates or splendid ceremonies. This phase offered only stone, cold winds, and mountain roads so long that one began to forget the scent of home. Bactria and Sogdiana, names that sound like whispers on a map. But once he set foot there, Alexander understood immediately. This was not the remainder of the empire. It was another world, a world where Persian central authority had always been thin, and tribal freedom was as dense as mountain rock. If Persia in the west could be broken by a single significant battle, the east offered no clear target. It was a network of high fortresses, hidden paths, and cavalry units that appeared and vanished. It did not confront directly. It gnawed. It bled you slowly. And this is what makes this war so distinctive in deep sleep of power. Absolute power is not tested by someone stronger, but by the endurance of countless minor cuts. Alexander pursued Bessus, the man who had betrayed and murdered Darius. Officially, this was a hunt for justice, to punish the kingslayer and reinforce Alexander's legitimacy as heir to the Persian order. But in truth, it was also a psychological pursuit. Alexander could not allow his story to end with Darius dead while the murderer lived. The chase dragged on, across rivers, across deserts, through lands where the wind cut like knives. At last, Bessus was betrayed by his own men and handed over. Alexander executed him as a traitor. Bessus's death marked a line. No one was permitted to kill a king without punishment, even in an empire already fallen. But Bessus's death did not end the war. It only changed its shape. Resistance continued, now under the leadership of a gifted local commander, Spitamenes. He did not seek to defeat Alexander in a grand battle, but he chose something more corrosive: constant harassment, attacks on supply lines, ambushes of small units, endless pursuits that dragged Macedonian forces across unforgiving terrain. Gradually, what eroded was not only strength, but spirit. The Macedonian soldiers were accustomed to swift victories: Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela. They were used to explosive moments where war could be finished with a single decisive thrust. Here, war did not end. It stretched on like an unceasing cold wind, blowing through armor, into sleep, into memories of home. They grew tired, and when people grow tired, they begin to look at their king differently, not with admiration, but with a silent question in their eyes: how much farther must we go? Alexander, too, began to change. Prolonged war hardens a person, and sometimes makes them unfamiliar with themselves. Alexander adopted more Persian customs, rituals, dress, and forms of address. To him, this was politics. To rule a multicultural empire, one must speak its language. But to many Macedonian officers, it was betrayal. They had conquered Persia to defeat it, not to bow before Persian ceremony. Tension smoldered like embers beneath ash. Then one night, the embers flared into flame, not on the battlefield, but at a banquet. In Maracanda, amid wine and strained laughter, Alexander erupted into a fierce argument with Clitus the Black, his childhood companion, the man who had saved his life at Granicus. Clitus voiced what many thought but dared not say: that Alexander was forgetting his origins, that he was becoming an Eastern king, that his glory was not created by him alone. In that moment, one can see the tragedy of power. The higher a leader rises, the more easily counsel sounds like an insult. Alexander exploded in rage, not the rage of a young man anymore, but the rage of someone long, accustomed to being right, because history had repeatedly confirmed him through victory. And then, like a blade cutting into his own memory, Alexander seized a spear and killed Clitus, an act so sudden that no one could stop it. Then, silence. Some deaths on the battlefield are called heroic. This death carried no glory, only a terrible emptiness, as if a part of Alexander's youth had been pierced by his own hand. Almost immediately, remorse surged like a fever. Alexander locked himself in his tent for days. He neither ate nor slept. He saw no one. He wept, cried out, cursed himself. This pain was not only grief for a lost friend. It was pain born of a terrifying realization. Power not only kills enemies, it can kill those closest to you, and sometimes by your own hand. In deep sleep of power, this is the critical point. When power becomes absolute, the boundary between will and fury grows thin, and it takes only one night, one cup of wine, one ill-timed sentence, for that boundary to collapse. Thus the guerrilla war in the East was not only a war against Spitamenes or mountain fortresses, it was a war Alexander fought against the distortion of himself. Distortion born of prolonged conflict, of the loneliness of the throne, of the belief that he was chosen, and of the deep fear that if he stopped, he would no longer be the Alexander of legend. Yet the war continued, and to end it, Alexander would need an action both daring and symbolic, an udar to the pride of local chieftains, a way of saying, "There is no height so great that I cannot reach it." In the next part, you will see him confront the Sogdian rock, where defenders mocked that only men with wings could capture it. And there, Alexander would once again prove, sometimes power does not need wings. It needs people willing to climb sheer cliffs in the darkness, to change the morning of history. There are places not built to defend. They are built to challenge. The Sogdian fortress was such a place. After months dragged down by guerrilla warfare, by ambushes, severed supply lines, deaths without glory, Alexander understood that he was facing a different kind of enemy, one that did not form ranks to be defeated, but hid within terrain and pride. In the east, there were fortresses perched atop cliffs so high that even the wind had to change direction as it passed. They were not built merely to repel invaders. They were constructed to declare one clear message to the world: we belong to no one. And when Alexander approached the Sogdian fortress, that message was sharpened with mockery. The defenders looked down upon the Macedonian army, upon the ladders, the ropes, the weary soldiers, and laughed. They said Alexander could take the fortress only if he had soldiers with wings. A taunt, but in Alexander's ears it sounded like a direct challenge to the story he was living, the story of a man without limits. Some people respond to mockery with anger. Alexander usually responded with thought. He did not launch a frontal assault. He studied the cliff. He studied the snow. He studied at night. And then he did something only a man who believed in his own will to an extreme degree would do. He turned mockery into a mission. He called for the best climbers among his troops. 300 volunteers stepped forward, not because they were unafraid, but because in Alexander's army, loyalty was sometimes proven by stepping into the absurd. They carried ropes, stakes, iron hooks, and when night fell, they began to climb. Imagine the scene like a dream. Sheer rock, cold stone, hands clinging to narrow cracks, breath turning white in the darkness. One slip meant death. One loud sound meant arrows from above. Yet they climbed, slowly, silently, like ghosts. Not all survived. Some fell and vanished into the night, like grains of sand slipping off the edge of the world. And then dawn came. The light of early morning was not radiant. It was cold, thin, and sharp. But in that light, the defenders looked up and saw the impossible. Macedonian soldiers standing on the heights above them, soldiers with wings. The fortress surrendered. It was a strange victory. Little blood, no great shouts, yet immense psychological weight. It told the entire region that there was no height high enough to escape Alexander's will. It also told his army that if the king chose something, the world would yield. But in that very moment, another current began, softer, more hidden, and deeper than war. Among the captives was Roxana, daughter of a Bactrian nobleman. They said she was beautiful, but beauty alone was not what made Alexander pause at her gaze. There was something else, a vitality, an unbowed spirit, as if she herself embodied the essence of the land he was trying to hold. Alexander married Roxana, and immediately everything changed. On the surface, it could be told as a love story, a sudden light amid prolonged war. But deeper, it was a bold political decision. Alexander understood that an empire cannot be held by garrisons alone. It must be held by bonds. And in the ancient world, the strongest bonds were often forged through marriage. In that union, Alexander did not merely marry a woman. He married a symbol. He sent a message that this empire was no longer Macedonia ruling the East. It was an effort at unification, a new world being cast from two old ones. But his Macedonians saw it differently. They had followed him from Pella, from Chaeronea, from Granicus. They had watched him burn Persepolis. They had endured winters and ambushes in Sogdiana. and now they saw their king marry an Eastern woman, adopt Eastern customs, and speak more often in the language of the East. To them, this was not unification. It was a distance. And from there, a more resounding crack formed. Not a crack of open betrayal, but a crack of feeling. The sense that the king no longer entirely belonged to them. This is the familiar tragedy of great power. When you try to embrace too many worlds, you begin to lose closeness with the one that lifted you up. Alexander likely knew this, but he also learned something else. If he ruled only as a Macedonian king, the empire would explode the moment he turned away. If he wanted a lasting legacy, he had to create a new ruling class, one that did not speak only Greek or only Persian, but could live within both. Thus, the marriage to Roxana was the first stone in the wall of unification, but it was also the first stone in the wall separating Alexander from the very people who had built the empire with him. And as with everything in deep sleep of power, we see that power is not merely victory. It is the price of choices that cannot please everyone. When the East had been partially pacified, by climbing cliffs, by marriage, by suppression, an old ambition returned. Alexander looked at the map and saw a vast blank space. India. To the Greeks, it was a land of legend, rich, strange, and so distant it seemed like the edge of the world. Alexander could not look at an empty space without wanting to fill it. In the next part, he will cross the Hindu Kush, enter the Indus Valley, and face a new kind of enemy, not Persian satraps, but Indian kings and massive war elephants like living fortresses. And as he advances toward the Hydaspes River, you will feel it clearly. This journey is no longer only about conquering land. It is the pursuit of the limits of ambition itself, a limit that, in the end, will not be faced by an enemy, but by the man himself. There are moments when, having traveled too far from home, human beings step into a land that is not only geographically different, but different in feeling. The air feels different. The scent of the soil is different. Even the way time flows feels altered. For Alexander, India was such a land. After Sogdiana and Bactria, after sheer rock peaks, fortresses hanging off cliff faces, and prolonged guerrilla wars that wore down the spirit itself, a conqueror might reasonably have stopped. He could have returned to Babylon, consolidated the empire, and lived out a title already vast enough to enter legend. But Alexander did not live by enough. He lived by absence. And on the map of the known world, the East was always an absence, both inviting and defiant. Greeks spoke of India as they spoke of the edge of myth, a place of unimaginable wealth, rivers vast as seas, strange beasts, and kingdoms ordered by rules unlike anything they understood. So when Alexander looked eastward, he did not see merely a campaign. He saw a promise. If he went farther still, he would touch the limits of the world and make those limits his own. The march began with the crossing of the Hindu Kush. These mountains were not simply a barrier, they were a test of will. Narrow paths, freezing winds, and altitude that turned breathing into labor. There were nights so cold, it felt as though the sky itself were trying to pull men back into the earth. Yet the Macedonian army continued, step by step. They had grown accustomed to following Alexander as one follows a flame. Wherever it moves, it burns, and it does not know how to stop. When they descended into the Indus Valley, the world changed its tone. Here, there was no longer the dry stone of eastern Persia. The land grew fertile. The air is heavier with moisture, vegetation richer, and the sound of water Abundant, deep-flowing water became a constant undercurrent to the conquest. But India was not a unified empire like Persia. It was a tapestry of rival kingdoms, local rulers, and shifting alliances. Alexander quickly grasped the rule of such a land. In a fragmented world, power does not come only from the sword. It comes from knowing whom to stand beside. At Taxila, he met Taxiles, a king who saw opportunity in an alliance with the invader. Taxiles did not yield his kingdom out of weakness. He yielded out of calculation. If Alexander could not be resisted, then standing close to him offered survival, and perhaps leverage against local rivals. For Alexander, this was a strategic gift. It provided a base, supplies, routes, and proof that not every Indian kingdom viewed him as an enemy to be destroyed. But allies were only half the story. The other half of India consisted of those who would not bow, and among them, one name rose like a cliff in midstream: Porus. Porus, king of the Pauravas, was not the kind of leader intimidated by reputation. He was tall, imposing, and bound to his land like roots bound to soil. Porus did not wish to become a chapter in Alexander's story. He wanted Alexander to become a story that ended here. What made Porus dangerous was not courage alone. It was weaponry, war elephants, 200 elephants, enough to turn a battlefield into a nightmare for cavalry. To the Macedonians, horses were companions in war, engines of movement, symbols of the decisive charge. But horses fear what they do not understand, and elephants, massive, unfamiliar in scent, trumpeting like thunder, awakened a primal terror. Here, Alexander's power confronted something his earlier victories could not immediately solve: otherness. The confrontation took shape along the banks of the Hydaspes River. The monsoon swelled its waters. Currents ran fast. Banks were slick. The sky seemed perpetually laden with damp weight. Porus arrayed his forces along the shore, elephants standing like living pillars, forming a wall both physical and psychological. From a distance, everything declared the same truth: a frontal assault would be suicide. Alexander stood on the riverbank and watched. In deep sleep of power, this is a revealing moment. The most powerful individuals often pause in long silence before deciding. They are not silent from fear. They are quiet because they are listening to the battlefield, to the terrain, to the rhythm of water, wind, and rain. Alexander understood that this was no longer Persia. In Persia, he could strike at the heart of an empire by charging directly at Darius. Here the enemy was not a system held together by a single, central symbol. The enemy was a local king, armed with weapons that made familiar tactics dangerous, and that forced Alexander to do what power sometimes resents most: adapt. But before adaptation comes acknowledgement. India did not wait for him. It did not bow to reputation. It demanded that he prove himself again. Not that he could conquer, but that he could conquer a world fundamentally different from his own. Night fell. Rain tapped softly against the tents. The Hydaspes flowed in darkness. Macedonian soldiers looked across the river and saw elephants standing like black silhouettes. Perhaps for the first time in many years, a clear feeling surfaced among them: we may not win this easily. And that feeling is what makes the next part heavier, deeper. In the next part, the Battle of the Hydaspes and the Limits of Ambition, Alexander will devise a complex plan: feints, a stormy night crossing, and the cold intelligence required to defeat war elephants. But even in victory, something else will emerge: the exhaustion of the army, and the question no one dares to speak aloud: How much farther will we go? There are nights when nature is not merely a backdrop. It becomes an ally, or a warning. On the night along the Hydaspes, rain did not fall like rain. It poured down like a curtain. The wind blew on, making the tents shudder like small boats on a dark sea. The river swelled and churned, carrying branches and mud in its rush. And on the opposite bank, in the damp, cold darkness, Porus's elephants stood still, vast black masses, like living fortresses guarding a gate. This was Alexander's greatest trial in India. Not simply how to win, but how to win when everything familiar had been overturned. A direct crossing would be suicide, but to remain still was to admit a limit. Alexander could not endure standing still. He began with something that seemed small: deception. Day after day, he had his troops move along the riverbank, feigning preparations to cross. At night, the sound of hooves rose and fell. Torches flared, then vanished. Porus was forced to remain tense, permanently on alert, and prolonged waiting, unceasing, unresolved, is a form of exhaustion more profound than battle itself. It wears a person down through vigilance. In deep sleep of power, deception is not only a tactic, it is psychology. You force your enemy to live in incomplete sleep, not because of noise, but because of the fear that the decisive moment could arrive at any time. Then came the stormy night. Amid wind and rain, Alexander led an elite force away from the main camp. They moved upstream in silence, hearing only water and breath. They chose a crossing point, Porus least expected. A vast stretch of river, but one broken by a sandbank and a small island that divided the current. The water cut into the skin, armor weighed heavily, horses trembled, yet they crossed, not through brute strength, but through a resolve forged over many years. Those who had crossed Gedrossia, who had climbed the Sogdian fortress, who had survived guerrilla war in the east, would not allow a river to stop them. As pale dawn spread across the gray sky, Alexander stood on the far bank. Porus discovered the crossing and reacted at once. He did not panic. He did not flee like Darius. He did what a warrior king does. He advanced, formed his ranks, and placed the elephants at the center, like stakes driven into the earth. And then the Battle of the Hydaspes began. This was not a beautiful battle in the classical Greek sense. It was wet, heavy, and chaotic. The ground was sodden. Mud clung to the feet. Every movement required double the effort. And when the war elephants charged, one could feel primal fear ripple through the ranks. Elephants do not fight like men. They do not understand formation. They know only how to advance and crush. They trampled infantry, shattered lines. Horses panicked. The trumpeting, the cries of men, the sound of steel striking thick hide, all merged into a noise as heavy as a storm. But Alexander did not win by being unafraid. He won by doing what only the coldest minds can do amid chaos, breaking a monster down into its weaknesses. He ordered javelin throwers to target the elephant drivers, not to kill the elephants, but to kill the men who commanded them. He directed infantry to strike at legs and trunks, sensitive points. When the elephants felt pain, they panicked, and when they panicked, they turned back, trampling Porus's own troops. The most terrifying weapon became a blade, cutting into the hand that wielded it. On one flank, Macedonian cavalry flowed like water, striking from the sides. Elsewhere, the infantry held firm, enduring wave after wave of impact. For hours, the battle was a contest of wills, and gradually, Porus was forced back. But Porus did not break. He fought like a tree being felled, standing until he could stand no longer. When wounded and surrounded, he still carried himself as a king, neither begging nor kneeling, and it was this that made Alexander pause. When Porus was captured, Alexander asked how he wished to be treated. Porus replied simply, "Treat me as a king." Alexander looked at him, and in that gaze came recognition. There are enemies whom, if you crush entirely, you create only endless hatred, but if you honor them, you can turn them into pillars of a new order. Alexander spared Porus. Not only spared him, but he also allowed him to keep his kingdom, even to expand his authority as an ally. It was a victory both military and political, but it was also an expensive one. The Battle of the Hydaspes cost the Macedonians more lives than any battle before, not because Alexander had grown weaker, but because the world had grown different, and his army, having gone too long, too far, began to feel that each new victory demanded more blood than the last. Alexander still wished to press on. He heard tales of greater kingdoms farther east, of the Ganges, of even larger armies. To him, these were not warnings, they were invitations. But to his soldiers, they were in despair. At the banks of the Hydaspes River, years of accumulated exhaustion finally found a voice. They refused to go on, not out of cowardice, but because they were spent of strength, spent of sleep, spent of memory of the original reason for the journey. In deep sleep of power, this is a crucial moment. For the first time, Alexander's will encountered a wall that could not be broken by the sword. He raged, he pleaded, he threatened, he reminded them of glory. But glory does not warm blistered feet, does not cure fevers, does not replace a homeland grown impossibly distant. In the end, Alexander stepped back, not because he was defeated by an enemy, but because he was defeated by a truth. Ambition, no matter how vast, still requires human beings to carry it. He agreed to turn back, but the decision to return brought no peace. It merely opened another trial, a trial of survival. Sometimes retreat is more dangerous than advance, and the road home, across rivers, through hostile tribes, through the desert, would demand that Alexander demonstrate another form of power, the power of endurance. In the next part, the return journey will become a prolonged nightmare, with arrows piercing lungs, with days of thirst, and with one symbolic act that says everything about Alexander, when he pours a helmet full of water onto the sand and declares that if there is not enough for everyone, then there is not enough for him. There are retreats that do not take the shape of defeat. They take the shape of truth. When Alexander turned away from the Hydaspes River, he did not merely turn his back on a body of water. He turned his back on the idea that the world was limitless before his steps. From that moment on, the journey home was no longer the reverse path of victory. It became another trial, harsher, quieter, and more merciless. The Macedonian army began its withdrawal along multiple routes. One contingent followed the Indus River, where Alexander decided to build ships and send the army downstream, a mode of travel both practical and dangerous. The river was wide, its currents strong, its banks lined with lands never entirely subdued. Here, war did not unfold in grand formations, but through sudden arrows, slammed gates, and lightning-fast ambushes. At the stronghold of the Malians, Alexander's familiar recklessness nearly became the end of the entire story. In a moment of impulse, perhaps born of exhaustion, perhaps of an instinct that never allowed him to stand aside, he was the first to climb the ladder and leap into the besieged city, alone, without waiting for formation, without waiting for his men. The gates slammed shut behind him. Arrows fell like rain. One pierced his armor and entered his lung. The king collapsed. In that instant, there was no legend, no title, only a human being struggling to breathe, blood flooding his chest. When the Macedonian soldiers finally broke through the gates and surged inside, they no longer fought a battle. They released the panic of fearing their king's death into a frenzy of rage. The city was razed, not as a victory, but as a desperate reflex. Alexander survived, but death had come very close. Close enough that from then on, every breath carried a new awareness that this body, once the spearhead of countless battles, was no longer invulnerable. The journey continued, and Alexander's next decision left many in silence. He divided the army. Nearchus was entrusted with command of the fleet, sailing along the coast back toward Persia. A voyage battered by storms, but with the hope of resupply. Most of the army took easier inland routes. Alexander, he chose the most challenging path, the Gedrosian desert. This was not merely a tactical decision. It resembled a personal vow. Alexander did not want it said that he chose the easy road while his soldiers suffered. He tried to walk with them through the most significant hardship. Gedrosia does not kill with swords. It kills with time, scorching sun, dry winds, scarce water. By day, the ground grew too hot to touch. By night, the cold made bones seem to crack. Columns of men stretched on, moving slowly, no longer speaking, only breathing, only dragging their feet. People died not in battle. They died of exhaustion, of thirst, of disorientation. Thousands never left that desert. They remained there like anonymous dots on a map. No graves, no chronicles. Alexander endured as they did. No comfortable tent, no special rations, and in deep sleep of power, there is a small moment, heavier than many victories, that captured his entire style of leadership. A patrol discovered a small amount of precious water. They brought it to Alexander in a helmet, enough for one person, only one, to live a few more hours. Alexander looked at the water, then at the cracked faces around him, and he poured it onto the sand. If there is not enough for everyone, then there is not enough for me. No speech, no ceremony, just a gesture. But in that desert, the gesture weighed like an oath. It declared that power was not drinking first. Power was an enduring thirst together. Those who emerged from Gedrosia were no longer the radiant army that had crossed the Hellespont. They were shadows, thin, weathered, silent. Yet within that silence was something else. The bond of those who had seen the very edge of endurance. When they returned to Persian lands, war had changed its shape. There were no more great battles. Instead came the uncomfortable truths of rule, corruption, abuse of power, an order frayed during Alexander's long absence. Alexander responded swiftly and harshly. Corrupt satraps were executed. Order was restored, not by persuasion, but by necessary fear. Yet one could sense a change. Alexander was no longer a king living only for the next campaign. He was trying to mend an empire stretched too thin. In his mind, perhaps two Alexanders now coexisted. One still dreamed of new conquests, Arabia, lands even farther beyond. And another, quieter, was beginning to understand that power, once too vast, no longer allows you to look away from it for long. The journey home thus did not end in triumph. It ended in clarity, a clarity born of seeing how many had died, not by the enemy's hand, but because of the path he had chosen. And as Alexander set foot once more in the heart of his empire, carrying both glory and ashes, he entered the final stage, the hardest stage for any conqueror, holding together a world no longer whole. In the next part, you will see Alexander confront an unstable empire, resistance within the Macedonian ranks, and the grief of losing Hephaestion, the one friend who truly understood him. And at Babylon, amid new plans and final banquets, power will meet an enemy no army can defeat: death. There is a paradox that every conqueror must eventually taste. Victory may be achieved in a single day, but ruling can make a person grow old in a single night. When Alexander returned from Gedrosia, he did not come back as a man who had merely conquered another land. He returned as someone who had passed along the edge of survival itself, and carried in his eyes the gaze of one who had seen too many corpses not on the battlefield, but scattered along the road he himself had chosen. Yet what awaited him in Persia was colder still than the desert, an empire that, during his absence, had begun to fracture from within. In the distant provinces, the satraps, the governors entrusted with authority, had grown accustomed to operating without oversight. Power, when unobserved by its master, often slips into a very human habit: greed. Taxes were distorted. Wealth was siphoned off. The population was pressed and exploited. Their cries never reached Alexander's ears, because between them and him lay thousands of miles, and an administrative apparatus that had learned how to conceal. When Alexander finally heard, he did not soften. He judged. He punished. Several satraps were executed, swiftly, decisively, like a blade cutting away rotted flesh. To many this was cruelty, but in the logic of ancient power, it was the only way to remind the entire empire that the king still lived, and that the law still carried weight. Here, Alexander resembled Philip more than Achilles. No longer merely the man who charged the front lines, he had to become the keeper of order, and keeping order, at times, requires acts that weigh heavily on the heart. Yet the most significant instability did not come from the Persian satraps. It came from the very people who had helped build his legend, the Macedonians. Years of conquest had turned that army into something strange. They were not merely soldiers. They were witnesses. They were living memory. And they believed that Alexander belonged to them, like a fire lit in Macedonia, carrying the breath of home. But the Alexander of the East no longer resembled the Alexander of Pella. He wore a Persian dress in many ceremonies. He adopted Persian customs. He retained Persian officials in the machinery of rule. And he began recruiting and training Persian soldiers in the Macedonian manner, creating a new army, no longer of a single color. Politically, it was brilliant. Psychologically, it was a knife. For the Macedonians saw in this integration something terrifying. They could be replaced. They had followed him to the ends of the earth, yet now that world was being rebuilt in a structure where they were no longer at the center. Alexander understood that an empire meant to endure must rest on a broad foundation. But soldiers do not think in diagrams. Soldiers think in feelings. Who is us and who is them? And when that boundary blurs, loyalty can turn into jealousy, and jealousy into resentment. And so, at Susa, Alexander did something no Greek king had ever dared at such a scale. He organized a mass wedding. He and roughly 80 senior officers married women of the Persian nobility. By torchlight, amid music, the ceremony was both beautiful and heavy. It was a declaration. A new ruling class would be born of two bloodlines, two traditions, two memories. Alexander was attempting to turn the empire into a family. Not a family of affection, but of obligation. But a family forged by compulsion rarely calls it love. It calls it the loss of freedom. And then unrest erupted at Opis. The Macedonian soldiers mutinied. not as a small faction, but as a community that had endured for too long. They protested Alexander's favor toward Persian troops, protested his Easternization, protested his decisions as those of a king who now felt foreign. You can imagine the scene. A vast camp, wind blowing, murmurs rippling like waves. Alexander stepped out to face them, alone, or with very few guards. He was not facing enemies. He was facing the men who had once shielded his back in battle. This was the most brutal war of all, the fight to preserve loyalty. Alexander responded in a way wholly his own, first with anger, then with severance. He declared that those who no longer wished to follow him would be discharged, sent home, or replaced by others. It was a blow to pride. You think I need you. But then, as the silence stretched on, Alexander changed his tone. He spoke of the years they had walked together, of the rivers they had crossed, of the cities they had taken, of the dead and the living. Not a speech to defeat them, but a reminder that they had become part of one another, whether they wished it or not. In that moment, many wept, not because they had lost to Alexander, but because they realized they had changed, and so had he. They could no longer return to being ordinary soldiers. They carried too much history within them. The mutiny was reconciled, but the crack did not entirely disappear. It was merely covered by a fragile layer of order, an order that could shatter with one more shock. And that shock came from a place no one can defend against: private grief. Hephaestion, Alexander's closest friend, died of fever. To the outside world, it was the death of a general. To Alexander, it was the death of the one person who had walked beside him since youth, the one who understood him not as a legend, but as a man. Alexander collapsed. Not the collapse of weakness, but the collapse that follows when an inner pillar is torn away. He ordered a period of public mourning, a funeral of unprecedented splendor, rituals drawn out, as if form itself could preserve what could no longer be held, the presence of the lost friend. In deep sleep of power, this is the sharpest pain of authority. You may command armies, cities, empires, but you cannot command fate. And sometimes, a private death can shake you more deeply than a rebellion. Yet, after the funeral, Alexander rose again. He returned to Babylon, the administrative heart of the empire, and began planning new campaigns. Arabia, distant seas, horizons still untouched. But if you listen closely, another sound runs beneath those plans. The sound of a man trying to fill an emptiness with action. The greater the loss, the farther he wants to go. The deeper the pain, the more urgently he seeks to write a new chapter, as if a new chapter might cover the void left by the old one. And that is when history prepares its ending. In the next part, at Babylon, amid banquets, maps, and unfinished dreams, Alexander will fall ill. 10 days of fever will turn the man who conquered the world into a silent figure on a bed. And when he departs without a clear successor, the empire will reveal its final truth. It was held together by the will of a single individual, and when that will is extinguished, the world will divide like water slipping through open hands. When a story reaches its final passage, history no longer needs to speak loudly. It lowers its voice, it slows down, and it begins to whisper, not to conclude, but to ask. Babylon, spring of a city vast, like a tapestry woven from stone, water, and torchlight. Canals shimmer through the night. Massive walls stand still, as if long accustomed to watching kings arrive and depart. In a place that had once been the heart of empires, Alexander, only 32 years old, stood at the height of power, He drew maps. He discussed campaigns. He spoke of Arabia, of new sea routes, of horizons not yet named. But history, when it is about to close a chapter, rarely knocks. It enters so quietly that we notice only when it is too late. After a banquet, Alexander suddenly felt a burning heat. The fever did not arrive violently, but persistently, like a cord tightening a little more each day. He continued to attend meetings, continued to listen to his generals, and continued to issue commands. Then one morning, he could no longer rise. The voice that had once given orders to the world was reduced to a thin breath. 10 days passed. 10 days during which the empire held its breath. The generals stood around the bed, men who had followed him across rivers, through deserts, over mountain peaks. They looked upon their king as one looks at a dying flame, afraid to blow, afraid to touch. Some asked to whom he would leave power. Some asked about succession. Alexander did not answer. Perhaps he could not. Maybe he would not. Or possibly he, the man who believed so deeply in will, had not yet accepted that will, too, has limits. There was one final moment when the soldiers were allowed to pass by his bed, one by one. No weeping, no shouts, only sun-darkened faces, trembling hands raised into the air as if saluting a part of their own lives. Alexander no longer spoke. But in that silence, power did not vanish. It changed form, from command into memory. On June 10th, 323 BCE, Alexander died. He died without naming a clear successor. No grown heir, no testament. The empire, once held together by speed, genius, and presence, suddenly lost its axis. And when the axis disappears, every gear begins to turn in its own direction. Immediately after his death, power did not fall into the hands of others. It shattered. The generals, once standing behind Alexander, now faced one another. History remembers them by a name that sounds light, but is heavy with blood: the Diadochi, the successors. Early negotiations quickly gave way to suspicion. Suspicion turned into conspiracy. Conspiracy turned into war. The imperial map was torn into fragments, each bound to an ambition. Roxana, the eastern wife, and the child she carried became pieces on the board. Alexander IV was born into a world that did not wait. The child bore the name of the man who conquered the world, but there was no world ready to protect him. In the end, mother and son were murdered, quietly, like a chapter erased so another story could proceed. Alexander's political empire did not survive. It dissolved within a few decades, far faster than it had been created. Cities changed hands. New dynasties arose. Old oaths were forgotten. But history rarely preserves only one thing. What did not die were the traces. From Egypt to Central Asia, from the Mediterranean coast to the Indus, Greek became a shared language of trade and learning. Cities named Alexandria became crossroads of ideas. Greek art blended with Eastern forms. Myth met science. Philosophy meets experiment. A new world, neither purely Greek nor purely Eastern, was born. The Hellenistic world. In that world, people learned to see beyond tribe and bloodline. They debated in public squares using a common tongue. They measured the heavens with mathematics. They recorded, classified, and questioned. If Alexander did not leave behind a lasting empire, he left behind an ecosystem of thought, one that endured longer than any wall. And when we look back, we encounter the most profound paradox of this story. Alexander achieved what no one before him had. He made the world contiguous. But to do so, he had to move so quickly that he never built durable bridges for the future. His power was so personal that it required only himself to exist. When he vanished, that power did not collapse because it was weak. It collapsed because it was too individual. Perhaps that is the question history leaves us in the late hours of the night. Can a single individual carry a world? And if so, what becomes of that world when the individual disappears? In deep sleep of power, we do not seek a final answer. We only listen. We listen to the footsteps of a boy from Pella, raised on heroic dreams and philosophical reason. We listen to the thunder of hooves at Chaeronea, to the water breaking at the Granicus, to the desert wind of Gedrosia, and finally, to the silence in Babylon. The story closes not with victory, but with a fractured legacy, fractured so that light might pass through. From those cracks, the world learned how to connect, knew that power can open paths, but only knowledge and memory remain. And when the night grows deep enough, history whispers once more. It is not those who conquer the most who live the longest in memory, but those who change how humanity thinks about the world and about itself.